The last thing my father said to me before everything changed was, "Don't embarrass me." He said it quietly, almost casually, as if I were still 19 years old and standing in the foyer of his house waiting for permission to become my own person. As if the last 10 years had never happened. As if I hadn't spent a decade learning how to stay calm when people around me were panicking, how to make decisions when there were no good options left, and how to keep my hands steady when everything that mattered was beginning to fall apart. At the time, I had no idea that less than 10 minutes later, a two-star general would walk directly toward us and leave my father questioning everything he thought he knew about me. I didn't know that, before the evening was over, men and women whose respect he had spent years trying to earn would be looking at his daughter in a way he had never once looked at me himself. And I certainly didn't know that the moment he had spent a decade avoiding was about to arrive in one of the most public rooms in Washington. My name is Lauren Whitaker, and I'm a major in the United States Army. Until that evening, my father had never really understood what that meant, and I had stopped trying to explain it to him years before. I could start this story with my childhood, with the sprawling house in Northern Virginia, or with the first time I realized my father valued appearances more than feelings. But that isn't where the real turning point began. It began outside a formal White House reception in Washington, D.C. With my dress uniform pressed perfectly, an invitation in my hand, and a heartbeat doing something it hadn't done in years. I was standing in the check-in line when the man a few feet ahead of me turned his head, and for half a second, I didn't recognize him. Then I did. Charles Whitaker was 68 years old, founder of Whitaker Defense Logistics, and worth somewhere north of $35 million by most estimates. He had built his company over 3 decades through defense transportation contracts, overseas logistics networks, and an almost supernatural talent for remembering which powerful person owed him which favor. My father had spent most of his adult life entering rooms where people already knew his name, and he liked it that way. In fact, I think being recognized before he had to introduce himself had become one of the private measurements by which he judged whether he still mattered. We had barely spoken in years, not in any meaningful sense. There had been a few strained phone calls, a handful of short messages, and occasional updates passed through people who still knew both of us. But the ordinary relationship most fathers and daughters take for granted had disappeared long before that night. He saw me first. I watched recognition come over his face, followed almost immediately by something harder, and there was no smile to soften it. He looked me over from head to toe, taking in the uniform, the medals, the polished shoes, and the insignia on my shoulders. My father has always been able to evaluate a person in seconds. In business, that ability probably helped make him rich, because he could look at a stranger and estimate their influence, usefulness, ambition, and probably their annual income before the first handshake was over. That night, he looked at his own daughter exactly the same way, then stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Lauren, don't embarrass me." 10 years earlier, those 4 words would have ruined me. I would have immediately wondered what I was doing wrong, checked my posture, changed my expression, watched every word that came out of my mouth, and probably apologized without even knowing what I was apologizing for. When you grow up wanting the approval of someone who withholds it, you learn to take responsibility for their disappointment before they ever explain what you supposedly did. But I wasn't that girl anymore. Something inside me had changed so gradually over the years that I hadn't noticed the exact moment it became permanent, and now his words reached me but had nowhere to land. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply turned toward the check-in table and handed over my invitation. A young woman in a black blazer stood behind the table with a tablet in her hand. She gave me a professional smile, checked my name, scanned the information on the screen, and then her expression changed. The shift was subtle, but I noticed it because I had spent enough years around military personnel and government staff to recognize the instant ordinary courtesy turns into alertness. She looked at me again, then glanced beyond my shoulder toward the far side of the reception area, where several senior officers were gathered near members of the diplomatic staff. One of them wore 2 stars. The woman excused herself and crossed the room with more purpose than someone performing a routine check-in task should have had. My father had already started turning away, apparently ready to return to whatever conversation he'd been having before spotting me, but something about the speed of her movement caught his attention. She approached the general and spoke quietly enough that I couldn't hear every word, but I heard the part that mattered. "Sir, she's here." The general's head came up immediately, and he looked straight in my direction. My father saw it happen. He turned back toward me, and for perhaps the first time in my life, Charles Whitaker looked at his daughter, without being certain what he was looking at. He had spent years assuming he understood exactly who I was and exactly how far I could go without him. That certainty was beginning to crack before anyone had even said my rank aloud. To understand why that moment mattered, you have to understand the world my father came from and the one he believed he had created for me. I grew up in Northern Virginia in a house with more rooms than 3 people could reasonably need, complete with a circular driveway, stone columns, polished floors, and formal names for spaces most families would simply call rooms. We had a formal dining room, a library, a study, guest suites, and enough unused square footage to make silence feel architectural. When I was young, I thought everyone lived that way. It took me years to realize that our home functioned less like a place where people simply lived and more like a permanent display of my father's success. To his credit, he hadn't inherited his fortune, and that mattered deeply to him. Whitaker Defense Logistics began with one leased warehouse, a handful of contracts, and my father working hours that probably would have broken most people. Whatever else I came to believe about him later, I never denied that he had built something impressive. By the time I reached middle school, his company was handling defense-related logistics across several continents, and by high school, he moved through Washington business circles with the confidence of a man who had learned that almost every problem had either a price, a phone number, or both. He taught me that lesson early. Money was security, reputation was leverage, influence was protection, and the Whitaker name was something I had a responsibility to preserve. My father talked about our last name the way other people talked about family history. To him, it wasn't simply who we were. It was an asset, something that could appreciate or be damaged depending on how carefully we managed it. At dinner, I listened to stories about contracts, negotiations, political connections, business rivals, favors owed, favors collected, and men who had made the mistake of underestimating him. When I was younger, I loved those stories. I thought my father was fearless, and I mistook his ability to dominate a room for strength. It took me a long time to understand that strength and control are not the same thing, and that a person can appear powerful while still being terrified of anything he cannot direct. My father loved the appearance of family. I believe that now more than I did when I was younger. He liked photographs where everyone looked accomplished, polished, coordinated, and grateful, and he liked introducing me at events when whatever I was doing fit comfortably into the future he had imagined for me. He enjoyed the idea of having a successful daughter almost as much as he enjoyed the idea of having a successful company. The problem was that his definition of success left almost no room for a life he hadn't chosen. Our relationship didn't collapse in one dramatic argument. The distance accumulated slowly through disagreements, dismissive comments, and the steady realization that every decision I made for myself felt to him like a rejection of something he owned. Then I told him I wanted to join the army. I can still remember the exact look on his face because his expression moved through 3 different emotions before he settled on anger. First came confusion, not ordinary confusion, but the look of a man who believed he must have misheard me because what I had said made no sense inside his understanding of the world. Then came embarrassment, quick and instinctive, as though he had already imagined having to explain my decision to people at the club. Finally came anger, which was familiar territory for him. "You want to throw away everything I've built so you can put on a uniform?" he asked, and the way he said the word uniform told me almost everything I needed to know. "I'm not throwing away my life," I told him. "I'm choosing it." He stared at me as if I were deliberately refusing to understand something obvious. "You already have choices," he said. I told him I knew that. He reminded me that I had every advantage most people spent their entire lives trying to get. And when I said I knew that too, his frustration sharpened. "Then why would you choose to live like you? Have nothing?" There are sentences that disappear the moment an argument ends, and there are sentences that stay inside you for years. That one stayed because, in a single question, my father finally revealed how he measured a person's worth. To him, value was external. It was what you owned, who knew your name, what doors opened when you entered a building, and how impressive your job title sounded when someone introduced you over dinner. Choosing a life built around service, discipline, orders, sacrifice, and physical hardship wasn't courage in his mind. It was waste, and perhaps worse, it was a kind of waste he couldn't explain to the people whose opinions he cared about. He tried everything he knew to change my mind. He offered me a position at the company, then a better position, then graduate school paid for anywhere I wanted, followed by introductions, promises, warnings, and eventually threats disguised as concern. Every offer sounded generous if you ignored the condition hidden underneath it. I could become anything I wanted, as long as it was something he respected. By then, though, I had already made my decision, and the night before I left, I packed one duffel bag. That detail still matters to me because I had grown up in a house where almost anything I wanted could be delivered, purchased, arranged, or solved within a phone call. Yet when I stood in that marble foyer preparing to leave, everything I intended to carry into the next phase of my life fit over one shoulder. A few clothes, basic personal items, documents, and nothing from the financial structure my father had built around me. There was no family credit card in my wallet, and no agreement that I could come back the moment life became uncomfortable. I remember standing near the front door waiting, part of me expecting him to come down and stop me, while another part hoped he would simply hug me. I would have accepted almost anything that sounded like, "Be careful," or "Come home safe," or even, "I don't understand this, but you're still my daughter." Instead, he came down the staircase and stopped several feet away. He didn't hug me, didn't ask whether I was frightened, and didn't ask when he would hear from me again. He looked at the bag on my shoulder and said, "If you fail, don't come back here." I wish I could tell you I answered with something powerful, but I didn't. I looked at him for a few seconds, turned toward the door, and walked out. For a long time afterward, I thought that sentence should have broken me, and maybe he believed it would. Maybe some part of him expected the fear of losing the life he had built to send me back across that foyer before I reached the end of the driveway. Instead, his words became fuel, not warm or inspirational fuel, but something colder and cleaner that I could return to when I needed to remember why turning around was no longer an option. There were mornings during training when I was exhausted before the day had properly begun. There were moments when my body hurt in places I hadn't known could hurt, when sleep felt like a memory, and when every weakness I had ever hidden from myself seemed exposed at once. On some of those mornings, I heard my father's voice in my head telling me that if I failed, I shouldn't come back. I didn't keep going because I wanted to punish him, at least not entirely. I kept going because I realized I had spent my childhood waiting for him to tell me I was worth something without attaching that worth to his money. And I had finally become tired of waiting for another person to decide whether my life had value, so I learned to measure myself differently. I completed my training, earned my commission, and began accumulating the years my father never really saw. There were long days, harder assignments, mistakes I had to learn from quickly, and the first moments when another person's safety depended on a decision I made. I learned that leadership had almost nothing to do with being the loudest person in a room and everything to do with accepting responsibility when everyone else wanted someone else to blame. With each passing year, I was trusted with more, and the responsibilities became heavier because the consequences became more real. I was promoted, then promoted again, and I received assignments my father never knew about. Some of the operations I was involved in are still not things I can discuss in detail, but they changed the way I understood fear, loyalty, duty, and the price people sometimes pay for decisions made. Far from public view, for a while I continued calling home whenever something important happened. Every promotion brought out the same hopeful part of me that had once stood in the foyer, wanting nothing more than to hear my father tell me he was proud. I would pick up the phone, tell him what I had earned, and wait for the response that never came. His words changed, but their meaning stayed the same. Sometimes it was, "That's good, Lauren. When are you going to start thinking seriously about your future?" Other times he reminded me that there was still a place for me at Whitaker Defense Logistics if I ever wanted a real career. Once, after a promotion I had worked harder for than almost anything in my life, he told me, "It's still not a real career." I remember holding the phone away from my ear after the call ended and staring at the screen, not because I was furious, but because something inside me had finally become tired. There are only so many times you can bring someone your proudest moments and watch them treat each one like an inconvenience before you understand that continuing to offer them is another way of hurting yourself. Eventually, I stopped calling. It wasn't revenge, and I wasn't trying to punish him with silence. I was protecting the part of me that still believed his approval could determine whether something I had earned was real. Over time, the distance between us stopped feeling dramatic and became simply normal. His life continued in the world of contracts, influence, private dinners, business relationships, and rooms where his name opened doors. Mine continued in a world he had dismissed before ever bothering to understand it. Then, a few months before that evening in Washington, an invitation arrived. It was formal, understated, and important enough that I sat at my table with the envelope in front of me for several minutes before opening it. I won't tell you yet exactly why I had been invited, because that matters later. And part of what happened that night only makes sense when it is revealed in the order I learned to understand it myself. What I can tell you is that when I finally opened the envelope and read the details, I knew immediately that the event was not routine. I didn't call my father, didn't mention the reception, and never considered that he might be there, because, as far as I knew, our lives no longer overlapped enough for that possibility to matter. So when I stepped into that White House reception in Washington wearing my dress uniform and saw Charles Whitaker only a few feet away, I was every bit as surprised as he was. The difference was that I already knew why I belonged in that room, while my father assumed there had to be some explanation connected to somebody else's influence. That was the world he understood. Doors opened because powerful people opened them, invitations came because someone made a call, and status usually had a recognizable chain leading back to his money or access. It never occurred to him that I might have entered a room he valued without using a single thing he had given me. Now the woman from the check-in table had crossed the reception area and quietly told a two-star general, "She's here." The general looked toward me, ended the conversation he was having, and started walking in my direction with a kind of purpose that drew attention without requiring him to raise his voice. Beside me, my father went completely still. I could feel him trying to solve what he was seeing, searching for some connection he had missed. Some name he should recognize, some invisible string that would explain why one of the most senior officers in the room had changed direction the moment he learned I had arrived. For 10 years, Charles Whitaker had believed I was the daughter who had walked away from opportunity. He believed I had traded a privileged future for a uniform, chosen hardship when I could have chosen comfort, and turned my back on the only kind of success he understood. What he didn't know was that, while he had been waiting for me to realize my mistake, I had spent those same 10 years becoming someone he had never bothered to imagine. As the general came closer, and the conversations around us began to quiet almost imperceptibly, I watched uncertainty settle into my father's face for the first time that evening. In the next few minutes, he was going to discover that I had built something he could never have purchased for me, inherited for me, negotiated for me, or placed into my hands through a connection. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what he would think when he finally saw it. By the time the general started moving toward me, my father had already spent most of the evening doing what he did best, working the room. Charles Whitaker had been circulating through the reception for close to an hour before I arrived, moving easily from one conversation to another with the practiced confidence of a man who had spent decades making powerful people feel as if they had known him longer than they actually had. He remembered names, spouses, companies, committee assignments, old favors, recent promotions, and the kind of personal details that made people feel important. Watching him from a short distance, I was reminded that whatever else I thought of my father, he had earned his success in part because he understood rooms like this better than almost anyone I had ever met. He knew when to laugh, when to lean in, when to lower his voice, and when to place a hand lightly on someone's shoulder as if they were old friends. He had turned social instinct into a business tool, and after 30 years it looked almost effortless. Earlier, before the woman at the check-in table had spoken to the general, I had caught pieces of one of my father's conversations from across the room. He was talking with a man I recognized as a senior aide to a senator, laughing at something I hadn't heard. The aide glanced past him, saw me in uniform, and asked, "Is that your daughter?" My father followed his gaze toward me, and for a fraction of a second I saw hesitation cross his face before he covered it with a smile. "That's her," he said. Then he gave a short laugh and added, "She always had to do things the hard way." A moment later, quieter and almost as if he were reminding himself of an old disappointment, he said, "She could have worked for me." I heard every word, but I didn't turn around. Years earlier, I would have confronted him, or spent the rest of the evening replaying the sentence until I had convinced myself there was something shameful about the life I had chosen. By then, I knew better. My father had always measured the effect he had on people by their reactions, and I had finally learned that I did not have to give him one. If he wanted to describe my life as the hard way, that was his choice. He had never been there for the mornings when hard became necessary, the nights when exhaustion stopped mattering because somebody still needed an answer, or the moments when I learned that the difficult road could become the meaningful one, precisely because nobody had guaranteed you anything at the end of it. A few minutes after that conversation, he had made his way back toward me with a drink in one hand. He wasn't really drinking it. My father often carried a glass at events because it gave his hands something to do and made him look relaxed. But I had seen him spend entire evenings nursing the same 2 inches of bourbon. He stopped beside me, glanced around to make sure no one was listening, and said, "Stand up straight." I looked at him, genuinely uncertain whether he was joking. I was in dress uniform, standing exactly the way 10 years of training had taught me to stand, but his eyes were already narrowing. "Lost that expression," he added. "What expression?" "The one that makes it look like you don't belong here." That time I turned fully toward him. There had been years when a remark like that would have made me shrink inside myself, but the woman standing in front of him now had spent too much time in places where belonging was determined by competence, not by somebody else's approval. "I never said I didn't belong here," I told him. He stared at me for a beat longer than necessary. It wasn't the words themselves that bothered him. It was the absence of apology in them. My father had spent most of my childhood accustomed to resistance, eventually turning into compliance. Even when I argued with him, I used to end by trying to make peace. That night, I wasn't angry enough to fight him, and I wasn't insecure enough to submit to him. And I think that unsettled him more than either reaction would have. "Who put you on the guest list?" he asked. "I was invited." "Obviously, by whom?" I looked across the room, where senior military officers and civilian officials were gathered near the main reception area. "I think you're about to find out." He frowned, and I could almost see him beginning to search through his mental directory of people he knew. A deputy secretary, maybe. Someone at the Pentagon. A contractor who had seen my last name and made the connection. In my father's world, important invitations almost always had an origin that could be traced through influence. Someone called someone. Someone owed a favor. Someone wanted something later. The idea that my presence there might have nothing whatsoever to do with him did not seem to occur to him. That was when a young Army officer came across the room from the opposite direction. He saw me, adjusted his path immediately, and gave me a crisp salute. "Major Whitaker," he said. I returned it automatically. "Good evening." The interaction lasted only a few seconds, but when I looked back at my father, his expression had changed. He watched the young officer continue across the room, then looked toward the insignia on my uniform, as if he were seeing it for the first time. He knew I had been promoted over the years in the abstract way people know facts they have chosen not to care about, but hearing another officer address me with unmistakable respect was different. There was no family connection in that exchange, no politeness because of who Charles Whitaker was, and no favor being paid. The officer had seen my rank, recognized me, and responded according to a structure my father had never bothered to understand. Respect had always been complicated for him. In business, it could be negotiated, purchased, inherited, exchanged, or reinforced through money and access. He knew exactly what to do with that kind of respect. What he had never understood was the kind that accumulated quietly over years when no one outside your profession was watching. He didn't know what it meant to have people trust your judgment because they had seen you make decisions under pressure. He didn't know what it meant for someone to salute you, not because you were wealthy or connected, but because you had earned the responsibility represented by what was pinned to your uniform. I could have explained all of that to him, but I didn't. Some truths become smaller when you announce them yourself. We stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the low hum of conversations, glassware, and restrained laughter that filled the reception. My father looked as if he were recalculating something. It was strange to watch because uncertainty was not an emotion he allowed people to see often. For most of my life, he had been the person who walked into a room, assuming that if something important was happening, he either already knew about it or knew someone who did. Now information was moving around him that clearly involved his daughter, and he was outside of it. A staff aide appeared on the far side of the room and moved quickly toward the two-star general. She leaned toward him, spoke in a low voice, and glanced in my direction. The room wasn't silent, but I had been listening closely enough that one sentence carried through the space between us. "Sir, we're ready. We're only waiting on Major Whitaker." My father heard it too. I knew because every trace of social ease disappeared from his face at once. He turned toward me with a speed that made the movement almost abrupt. "Major Whitaker?" he repeated. It was the first time I could remember hearing my father say my rank without some dismissive tone wrapped around it. There was no joke in his voice and no impatience. There was only uncertainty, and I realized he was finally hearing the title not as an army technicality, but as something that other people in that room considered important. I didn't answer immediately, not because I wanted to humiliate him, but because I had spent years explaining myself to a man who had made a habit of refusing to listen. For once, I wanted the evidence to arrive without my help. He had always believed he knew exactly what my career amounted to, and if that belief was about to collapse, I wanted it to collapse under the weight of reality, rather than an argument between the two of us. The woman from the check-in table had returned to her station by then. She glanced down at her tablet once more, looked toward me, then confirmed, Major Whitaker. Yes, Mom. That seemed to be all the general needed. He excused himself from the diplomat he had been speaking with and began crossing the floor toward us. He didn't hurry in a way that would attract attention, but there was clear purpose in his stride, and people noticed. Conversations shifted as he passed. A few officers straightened almost instinctively, and the social noise around that section of the room dropped just enough that I could feel the change before I could fully hear it. I had experienced that kind of shift in command posts and briefing rooms before. The subtle concentration that occurs when someone with real authority has decided that the next thing deserves his attention. My father felt it too. He moved half a step back without seeming to realize he had done it. The general stopped in front of me and extended his hand. Major Whitaker, we've been expecting you. I shook it. Good evening, General. It's good to finally have you here. There was nothing theatrical in his voice. That was what made the moment land the way it did. He wasn't trying to impress anyone standing nearby, and he had no reason to flatter me. He was speaking to me the way senior officers speak, when the history behind a professional relationship is understood without needing to be announced to everyone in earshot. My father stood slightly behind my shoulder. For once, Charles Whitaker had nothing prepared to say. Normally, that would have been the exact moment he inserted himself into the conversation. He might have offered his name, mentioned Whitaker Defense Logistics, referred to a contract his company had handled, or identified someone he and the general both knew. My father could usually build a bridge between himself and almost any important stranger in 30 seconds. But this time, he seemed to understand instinctively that the conversation did not need him. The general did not recite my service history in the middle of the reception, and I'm glad he didn't. A great deal of military work sounds wrong when it is reduced to social event language, and some of what I had done was not mine to discuss casually anyway. He mentioned one operation in broad terms, enough to make it clear that he knew exactly who I was and why I had been invited. He said he had followed the situation closely, and that the outcome had mattered at levels far above the people who had been physically present when the decisions were made. My father listened without interrupting. Then a colonel standing nearby joined us. I recognized him immediately. We had worked together during a deployment several years earlier, at a time when a difficult operation had begun unraveling faster than anyone had anticipated. There had been no single heroic moment, nothing clean enough to turn into a movie scene. There had been a series of bad developments, incomplete information, exhausted people, and decisions that needed to be made before anyone had the luxury of certainty. I had done my job, so had many others. The colonel shook my hand and smiled. Good to see you again, Major. You too, sir. He glanced toward the general, and then, almost as an afterthought, said, Major Whitaker was the officer who kept that operation from falling apart. There are compliments that sound designed for an audience, and compliments that are almost uncomfortable because the person giving them sees them as nothing more than fact. This was the second kind. The colonel wasn't building me up. He was remembering what had happened. I glanced at my father. He had gone completely quiet. For 10 years, he had used phrases like playing soldier and not a real career, as if my life existed somewhere between a stubborn phase and a prolonged mistake. He had dismissed promotions without ever asking what I had needed to do to earn them. He had treated deployments as evidence that I was sacrificing a comfortable future, rather than proof that people had trusted me with serious responsibility. Now, a colonel and a 2-star general were standing in front of him talking about his daughter, as if her name carried history he knew nothing about. I could almost see old conversations replaying behind his eyes. Every phone call where he had responded to good news by reminding me about the company. Every time he had suggested that eventually I would get tired of the army and return to the life he had designed. Every time he had assumed my achievements mattered, only because I was still too stubborn to admit I had chosen the wrong path. The version of me he had carried around for a decade was colliding with the version of me these officers knew, and the difference between them was too large for him to ignore. The general looked toward him then, apparently noticing for the first time that he had been standing with us throughout the exchange. And you are? My father recovered enough to answer. Charles Whitaker. I'm Lauren's father. The general's expression warmed immediately. Her father? Yes. Well, then you must be proud. The sentence was simple. There was no accusation in it and no hidden knowledge. The general had no idea what had happened between us. He was doing what almost anyone would do after learning that the man beside a respected officer was her father. He assumed the pride was obvious. My father didn't answer. The silence lasted no more than a few seconds, but I felt every one of them. For one dangerous instant, I knew exactly what I could say. I could have looked at the general and told him, "He isn't." 2 words would have explained the entire distance between us. I had 10 years of evidence behind them, including the memory of walking out of my childhood home with a duffel bag while my father told me not to come back if I failed. Some wounded part of me wanted to say it. Not because it would help anything, but because there are moments when an old injury suddenly finds the perfect opportunity to hurt the person who caused it. I said nothing. That choice mattered more to me afterward than I expected. I didn't defend my father, but I didn't expose him either. I simply allowed him to stand inside the silence he had created. For years, I had tried to rescue our relationship by explaining his behavior to myself, by translating cruelty into concern or control into love. That night, I finally understood that I was not responsible for protecting him from the consequences of the way he had chosen to see me. The general, unaware of what was passing between us, gave my father a polite nod and turned back toward me. "Major, everyone's waiting for you." "Yes, sir." I moved to join him. As I stepped away, I became acutely aware of the strange balance of that moment. My father was standing in a room full of people who respected him for what he had built, the contracts he had won, the fortune he had made, and the connections he had accumulated over 3 decades. I was standing among people whose respect came from a completely different system, one in which my last name had never guaranteed me anything, and my father's bank account could not have carried me through a single difficult day. Neither kind of achievement was imaginary, and I had no need to diminish his in order to understand mine. But for the first time, he was being forced to recognize that the world contained measures of value over which he had no control. I fell into step beside the general as we headed toward the main room. I didn't look back at my father. I knew he was still there, but I did not need to see his face to understand what had happened. For most of his life, Charles Whitaker had been accustomed to occupying the center of whatever room he entered. Even when he wasn't the most powerful person present, he knew how to move close enough to power that people remembered him. He had built an entire adult identity around never being the man left standing outside an important conversation. That evening, for the first time I could remember, he was the one being left behind. I followed the general farther into the reception, where several people were already waiting. A few of them greeted me by rank, others by name, and each greeting quietly reinforced something my father had never understood. I had a life here that existed completely independently of him. These people did not know me as Charles Whitaker's daughter. Some of them probably had no idea who Charles Whitaker was. They knew me because of decisions made in difficult places, because of work completed when no one was taking photographs, and because of the responsibilities I had accepted when walking away would have been easier. As the formal part of the evening began, I tried to focus on the people around me, instead of on the man I had left several yards behind. I had waited too long for this night to let old family wounds consume it. Still, I could feel his presence at the edge of my awareness. Somewhere behind me stood the father who had once warned me not to embarrass him, watching a room full of senior officers treat his daughter as someone they had been waiting to see. What surprised me was how little victory I felt. I had imagined moments like this during some of the worst years between us. Not this exact White House reception, of course, but some future day when my father would finally be forced to admit that I had succeeded without him. In those private fantasies, I always thought it would feel satisfying. I thought vindication would be loud, almost intoxicating. Instead, standing there beneath the lights with conversations moving around me, I felt something much quieter. The need to prove him wrong had faded so gradually that I had not realized how little of it remained. The general introduced me to another group, and I answered questions, exchanged greetings, and allowed the evening to continue. Every so often, I caught sight of my father across the room. He was no longer moving through the crowd with the same effortless momentum he had before. He still spoke with people, still shook hands, still knew how to perform the social rituals he had mastered, but his attention kept drifting back toward me. For once, he wasn't watching to see whether I was behaving properly or whether I was making the Whitaker name look respectable. He was watching because he was trying to understand who his daughter had become during the years when he had refused to look. I didn't know yet whether that realization would change him. A single uncomfortable moment does not rewrite a person, and I had learned long ago not to confuse surprise with transformation. My father was still the same man who had built his life around leverage, control, and the belief that every valuable future could be engineered if you had enough resources. One general's respect was not going to erase 30 years of thinking in a matter of minutes. What I did know was that something had been broken open, and once a person sees evidence that contradicts a belief he has protected for years, he has a choice. He can retreat deeper into the belief, or he can finally begin asking what else he might have been wrong about. By the time the formal portion of the evening began winding down, I had nearly convinced myself that my father would choose the first option. It would have been easy for him to leave, return to his world, and rewrite everything that had happened into a version that protected his pride. He could tell himself the officers had exaggerated my importance, or that military people naturally praised their own. He could dismiss the evening as ceremony and go back to believing that eventually I would realize he had been right all along. But when I stepped away from the main group and headed toward one of the quieter side halls, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw my father approaching. He was moving more slowly than before, without the drink in his hand, and without the polished expression he had worn while circulating through the reception. His shoulders looked different somehow, not defeated, exactly, but less certain. For the first time that night, he didn't look like Charles Whitaker, founder of a multi-million-dollar company and a man accustomed to controlling the terms of every conversation. He looked like a father trying to decide what to say to a daughter he had just realized he barely knew. He stopped a few feet away from me and hesitated before speaking. That hesitation alone told me this conversation was going to be different, because my father had almost never entered a discussion without already knowing what outcome he intended to produce. Finally, he looked at me and asked, "Could we talk for a minute?" I said yes, not because I owed him anything, and not because one evening had erased 10 years of distance between us. I said yes because I could see that whatever had happened to him in that room was not finished yet, and some part of me had been waiting a decade to find out what Charles Whitaker would do when he finally encountered a version of his daughter that his money, influence, and certainty could no longer explain. My father and I moved farther into the side hallway, away from the main flow of the reception. The noise from the ballroom softened behind us until the music, laughter, and conversations became a low, indistinct hum. I had spent years imagining what it might feel like to stand face to face with him, after he finally understood that I had built a life without his approval, but none of those imagined conversations had prepared me for how ordinary the moment looked from the outside. There was no audience now, no general standing beside us, no senior officers watching him struggle for an answer. It was just the two of us under the warm hallway lights, and for the first time in a decade, neither of us had anywhere else to look. He started in the most predictable way possible. "You know," he said, adjusting his cuff as though the movement might help him recover some of his usual composure. "There are opportunities outside Army that could use someone with your experience." I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because I recognized the maneuver immediately. My father had just watched senior military leaders treat me with a level of respect he had never imagined I possessed. And somehow his first instinct was still to translate what he had seen into something he understood. If the Army had made me valuable, then perhaps that value could now be transferred into a world he considered legitimate. He told me there were companies looking for people with operational experience and leadership credentials. He mentioned advisory positions, executive roles, consulting work, and boards that paid more for a few meetings a year than many people earned working full-time. Then, with an almost deliberate casualness, he brought up Whitaker Defense Logistics. "There could be a place for you there," he said. "A serious one, not something symbolic. You've obviously built skills I didn't fully appreciate before tonight, and those skills could translate very well." I let him keep talking. When I was younger, I would have interrupted within seconds because every sentence would have felt like another attempt to erase the decision I had made. Experience had taught me something different. Sometimes the clearest way to understand what a person believes is to give them enough room to finish explaining it. So I listened while he described a future in which I left the Army and stepped into a senior role at the company. He talked about influence, compensation, access, and the kind of authority that came with a title recognizable to people outside the military. He told me he could introduce me to executives, policymakers, investors, and people who could open doors that years of service might never open on their own. The remarkable thing was that he believed he was finally respecting me. I could hear it in his voice. From his perspective, He had witnessed proof that I was more accomplished than he had assumed, and now he was responding by offering me a better seat at the table he had always wanted me to join. He still didn't understand that the table had never been the point. When he finally stopped, I looked at him and said, "You still don't understand." His expression tightened immediately. Understand what? I didn't leave home so I could spend 10 years proving I deserved a way back into your company. I didn't say you had to prove anything. You've been saying it since the day I left. That's not fair. I studied him for a moment. Years ago, those 3 words would have pulled me into an argument over details, and we would have spent an hour debating which sentences he had used, what he had meant, and whether I was interpreting them correctly. I wasn't interested in doing that anymore. I'm not trying to be fair to your memory of it, I said. I'm telling you what it was like to be your daughter. He looked away toward the reception hall. I could see the instinct to defend himself building behind his eyes, but he stayed quiet, so I continued. Every time I called you with a promotion, you told me there was still a place for me at the company. Every time I told you about an assignment I was proud of, you asked when I was going to start thinking about my future. You spent years treating everything I accomplished as something temporary I would eventually grow out of. I wanted you to have options. No, I said, keeping my voice calm. You wanted me to choose the option you understood. His jaw tightened. Is it so terrible that I wanted my daughter to have security? I have security. You know what I mean. Yes, I do know what you mean. You mean money. He looked at me sharply, but I didn't let the conversation turn into another fight. Money is not the problem, I told him. You built something successful, and you should be proud of that. The problem is that somewhere along the way, you decided your version of success was the only one that counted. I never said that. You didn't have to. He started to speak, then stopped. That alone would have surprised me years earlier. Charles Whitaker almost never abandoned a sentence once he had started it. He was a man who could turn almost any disagreement into a negotiation, and almost any negotiation into a contest he intended to win. Yet in that hallway, I could see that the arguments he had relied on for years were no longer working because the evening had already undermined the assumptions beneath them. I just want you to have a future, he finally said. There was something in his voice then that made me answer more gently than I otherwise might have. Dad, I already have one. He looked at me. I have a career. I have people who trust me. I have responsibilities that matter to me. I have a life I chose. What you keep calling a future is really a future you can understand. Because if I come work for you, then suddenly you know where I fit again. That's not what this is. Isn't it? He didn't answer. I let the silence sit for a moment before saying the thing I had finally understood about him. You've spent my whole life confusing wanting the best for me with wanting to decide what the best is. The reaction was small, but I saw it. His shoulders settled slightly, and the defensiveness in his face gave way to something less certain. My father was used to numbers, contracts, obligations, and terms he could define. Emotional truths were harder for him because they rarely came with clean boundaries. He could argue with an accusation. What he seemed less equipped to do was argue with a pattern once he could finally see it. There was something else I had never told him, something I had learned only recently. One of my mother's former assistants had stayed loosely in touch with me over the years. She had worked for our family long enough to know far more than most employees probably should have. And during one of our occasional conversations, she mentioned something my father had said shortly after I left. According to her, he had spoken with his attorney about what would happen if I came home after failing in the army. His instruction had been clear. If Lauren returns broke and defeated, she gets nothing. I had carried that knowledge quietly because, by the time I learned it, it no longer had the power over me that it might have had years earlier. Standing in that hallway, however, I decided he should know that I knew. Do you remember what you told your lawyer after I left? I asked. The change in his face was immediate. I've told my lawyer thousands of things. This one was about me. He said nothing. You told him that if I ever came crawling back, broke and defeated, you wouldn't give me $1. His eyes dropped for just a second, which was all the confirmation I needed. Who told you that? That doesn't matter. It matters to me. Of course it does. You want to know who said it, because then the conversation can become about whether they had the right to tell me. I'm not interested in that conversation. His face hardened slightly. You don't know the context. I almost laughed, but there was too much history in the moment for it to feel funny. What context would make that sentence better? I was angry. I know. You had just walked away from everything. I walked away from your money, Dad. I didn't walk away from everything. He looked toward the floor. For the first time that evening, I saw something that resembled shame rather than embarrassment. The difference mattered. Embarrassment is about how other people see you. Shame, when it is honest, is about finally seeing yourself. The strange thing is, I continued, you never had to follow through on it. He looked back at me. I never came home broke. I never came home defeated. I never asked you for money. I know that. No, I don't think you do. He frowned, so I told him about the house. 2 years earlier, I had bought a small place outside Fort Bragg. There was nothing grand about it. The first time I saw it, one section of gutter sagged badly enough that rainwater poured down the side of the house. The kitchen cabinets looked as if they had survived 3 different decorating eras, and the back steps needed work. I loved it almost immediately. It wasn't the kind of house my father would have considered impressive. But the first night I sat in that living room, surrounded by half-open boxes, I experienced a feeling I had never known in the enormous house where I grew up. Everything around me was mine because I had chosen it and paid for it myself. I saved for years, I told him. I used my salary. I watched what I spent. I did the kitchen a little at a time on weekends when I was home. I learned how to replace things instead of paying someone every time something broke, although I'll admit the plumbing nearly defeated me. A faint expression crossed his face, something that might have become a smile under different circumstances, but I continued before the conversation could become easier than it needed to be. There was no trust fund involved, no family credit line, no accountant moving money somewhere quietly so I could pretend I did it myself. Every mortgage payment, every repair, every piece of furniture came from work you spent years telling me wasn't a real career. He went silent. I had seen my father lose negotiations before. I had seen him angry, frustrated, insulted, and once or twice genuinely worried. What I had almost never seen was his entire framework for understanding a situation fail him at once. He had always assumed that eventually the practical realities of adulthood would prove him right. The military would disappoint me. The money would become too tempting. Or I would finally understand that the comfortable life he had offered was the sensible one. Somewhere in his mind, I think he had kept a door open at the company not simply because he loved me, but because he expected the day would come when I walked through it and admitted he had been right. That day never came. Instead, I had built a career he did not understand, bought a home with money he had not provided, and entered the White House that evening on an invitation he had not arranged. One by one, every piece of evidence he might have used to prove I still needed him had disappeared, and there was nothing left for him to bargain with. I would have helped you buy a house, he said eventually. I know. You could have had something much nicer. I know that, too. Then why didn't you ask? The question was so sincere that for a moment I simply looked at him. Because I needed to know I could do it without you. His face changed. I immediately realized how harsh that sounded, so I clarified. Not because accepting help is wrong, and not because I wanted to prove you were useless to me. I needed to know that if I built a life you didn't approve of, it could still stand on its own. I needed to know I wasn't one bad month away from having to come back and ask permission to be your daughter again. That's not how I would have treated you. I held his gaze. After a few seconds, he looked away. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. It wasn't combative. He wasn't searching for the right counter-argument, and I wasn't rehearsing my next defense. For once, both of us seemed to understand that some parts of the past were too well established to negotiate. You really thought I wanted you to fail? He asked. I knew you wanted me to come back. That's not the same thing. It was to me. He absorbed that quietly, and I could see the evening wearing down the armor he had arrived in. The man standing before me no longer looked like the father who had approached me at check-in and warned me not to embarrass him. That version of him had believed he understood the hierarchy of the room and my place within it. Now he had spent the better part of an evening discovering how much of my life had unfolded completely beyond his sight. I could have stopped there. Maybe I should have. But there was one truth I had carried longer than almost any other. And suddenly it seemed more important to say it now than to protect either of us from hearing it. You know what the strange part is? I asked. He waited. I used to think if I succeeded enough, you would finally be proud of me. He didn't interrupt, which was unusual enough that I noticed it immediately. For years, every time something happened, that was still in my head. Every promotion, every difficult assignment, every time somebody trusted me with more responsibility, part of me wondered if this would finally be the thing that changed your mind. I would tell myself I didn't care anymore, and then something good would happen, and I'd think about calling you. His eyes stayed on me, and there was no defense in them now. I kept measuring things twice. Once by what they meant to me, and once by whether they might finally be enough for you. Do you understand how exhausting that is? He swallowed before answering. I think I do now. The words surprised me because he didn't add anything after them. No explanation. No reminder that he had only wanted what was best. He simply stood there and listened. And tonight, I said, when that general came over, there was a time in my life when I would have thought this was the moment I'd been waiting for. I would have wanted you to see him shake my hand. I would have wanted you to hear the colonel talk about me. I would have wanted every person in that room to make you understand that I mattered. I paused, searching for the most accurate way to say what had changed. But when it happened, I realized something. I didn't need it anymore. His expression tightened slightly, as though those words hurt more than any accusation I had made. I don't mean I don't care what you think, I said. You're my father. Some part of me will probably always care, but I don't need you to tell me whether the last 10 years were worth something. I already know they were. For the first time that night, I felt no anger toward him at all. That surprised me more than anything. I had imagined this confrontation for so long that I expected the old resentment to arrive the moment I finally had the upper hand. Instead, I felt as if I had set down something heavy I had been carrying for so many years that I had forgotten the weight belonged to me. My father had spent most of his adult life believing that enough money could solve almost any problem. Money could create options, remove obstacles, make introductions, protect reputations, repair mistakes, and open doors that stayed closed to other people. To be fair, he had seen enough evidence to support that belief. $35 million and a lifetime of connections can solve a remarkable number of problems. But standing in that hallway outside a White House reception, he was finally confronting something his money could not reach. He could not purchase the years he had missed. He could not retroactively stand beside me through training, deployments, promotions, difficult decisions, and nights when I had needed a father, but learned to manage without one. He could not write a check large enough to turn himself into the man I had once needed him to be. More importantly, he could no longer buy his way back into the center of my life. I watched that realization settle over him slowly. Charles Whitaker had spent decades around men who believed every difficult situation contained a move if you were clever enough to find it. He was one of those men himself. If a contract stalled, he called someone. If a competitor got ahead, he changed strategy. If a door closed, he looked for the person holding the key. He had built an empire partly because he refused to accept that any problem was truly beyond negotiation. But there in the hallway, I could see him running out of moves. There was no job offer that would repair what had happened between us, because I did not want the job. There was no amount of money he could offer, because I no longer needed it. There was no important person he could introduce me to who could erase the respect I had already earned in a world that existed independently of him. For the first time in my life, my father was standing in front of a problem that could not be solved by making the right call. When he spoke again, the question sounded so different from everything else he had said that night that I almost wondered whether I had heard him correctly. Do you actually hate me? There was no anger in his voice, no accusation. The words came out rough and unguarded, stripped of the businesslike control he usually carried into every conversation. For one brief moment, he wasn't asking as Charles Whitaker, the man who had built a fortune and spent his life expecting answers. He was asking as my father. I thought about lying. A kinder daughter might have said no immediately. She might have softened the past, told him things had never been that bad, or reassured him that anger was different from hate. But after everything we had finally said to each other, dishonesty would have been another form of distance. I used to, I told him. He didn't flinch, although the pain crossed his face before he could hide it. There were years when I hated you, I continued. I hated you for making me feel like choosing my own life was something I had done to you. I hated you every time I called home, proud of something, and ended the conversation feeling smaller than when it started. I hated you because for a long time, I still wanted your approval even after I knew better than to expect it. He stayed completely quiet. But eventually, I figured something out. Hating you meant you still controlled part of me. I could be hundreds of miles away, living my own life, and one sentence from you could still determine what kind of day I had. I could spend months feeling good about a decision, then hear your voice and suddenly be 19 again, wondering whether I had ruined my future. I watched him take that in. So, I stopped. Stop hating me. I stopped giving the anger that much power. It took a long time, and I'm not going to pretend I never get angry when I think about certain things. But I don't build my life around proving you wrong anymore. He looked down at his hands, and I saw him rub his thumb slowly across the side of one finger, a nervous habit I remembered from childhood but hadn't seen in years. It was strange how quickly that small movement turned him from the intimidating man I had grown up, fearing, into someone older and more human. There was still one thing between us that had not been spoken aloud. One piece of the past I had carried physically through the years. I had brought it with me that night, tucked into my bag, even though I had told myself there was no reason to bring it. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe some part of me had known that if my father and I ever had this conversation, I wanted him to see exactly what I had been carrying. I reached toward my bag. My father watched me, uncertain. Inside was a folded letter, its edges softened from years of handling, and the creases worn pale from being opened and closed more times than I could count. It had followed me through moves, assignments, deployments, and every version of myself I had become since leaving that house in Northern Virginia. I had read it when I was angry, when I was homesick, when I doubted myself, and on nights when I needed to remember why going backward could not be an option. I pulled it out and held it for a moment before looking at him. He recognized the handwriting on the outside before I even gave it to him. And suddenly the color in his face changed. I held the folded letter between us for another second, before placing it in my father's hand. His fingers closed around it carefully, and the moment he recognized the paper, something changed in his expression. He didn't ask what it was because he already knew. Years had passed since he wrote it, but his handwriting was unmistakable. And so was the envelope that had once carried his final attempt to make me reconsider the life I had chosen. He unfolded it slowly, following the old creases, as if he were afraid the paper might tear, and I watched his eyes move across a message I no longer needed to read because I had memorized it years ago. Most of the letter had faded in importance over time, but one sentence had stayed with me through every move, every assignment, every promotion, and every night when doubt came looking for me. If you choose the army, you no longer belong to this family. For a long moment, my father said nothing. He simply stared at his own handwriting, and I wondered what it felt like to encounter an older version of yourself preserved that clearly on paper. Memory is generous when we want it to be. It softens tone, alters motives, and allows us to convince ourselves that maybe we weren't quite as cruel as someone remembers. Ink doesn't offer the same mercy. The sentence was there exactly as he had written it, without the protection of hindsight or explanation. And I could see him confronting the fact that whatever he had intended at the time, those were the words his daughter had carried with her for 10 years. "You kept this," he finally said. "I did." Why? I had asked myself that question many times. There were years when keeping the letter felt unhealthy, as if I were preserving an injury because I didn't know what would replace it if I let it go. Other times, it had felt like proof that I hadn't imagined the rejection or exaggerated how complete it had been. Eventually, though, the letter became something else. At first, I kept it because I was angry, I told him. Later, I kept it because I needed to remember that being left behind by someone doesn't mean you have to stop walking. He lowered his eyes to the page again. The hardness I had known all my life seemed to drain out of his face, leaving him looking older than he had when the evening began. I had spent years wondering whether he remembered writing those words or whether the moment that had shaped so much of my life had been just another angry week to him. Now I could see that he remembered enough. "I thought you would come back," he said. "I know. I thought, once you saw what the life was actually like, you'd realize you had made the wrong choice." "I know that too." He folded the letter carefully along the same creases that had been there for years. "I thought I was forcing you to think seriously about what you were giving up. You were telling me that your love had a condition." His eyes lifted toward mine. I didn't say it angrily. That was the strange part. 10 years earlier, I could barely have formed that sentence without my voice shaking. Standing there now, it was simply the truth. "You might not have meant it that way," I continued. "But that's what I heard. Choose the life I approve of, or lose your family." I spent a long time trying to decide whether you really meant it. His grip tightened slightly on the paper. I was angry. "I know." I was scared too. That surprised me, but I didn't interrupt. He looked past me for a moment before continuing. "You were walking away from a life I understood. I knew how to protect you in that world. I knew who to call, what to fix, what to give you. When you told me you were joining the army, suddenly none of those things mattered. I couldn't control what happened to you." There it was again, the word that had shaped so much between us, even when neither of us had used it directly. Control. For most of my life, he had confused protection with control so completely that I wasn't sure he knew where one ended and the other began. Yet hearing him admit fear beneath it changed something in the conversation. It didn't excuse what he had done, and I wasn't interested in rewriting the past to make it easier for either of us. But for the first time, I could see the frightened father behind the powerful man. He had responded to uncertainty the only way he knew how, by trying to eliminate it. When he discovered he couldn't control my decision, he tried to make the cost of choosing it unbearable. "You could have told me you were scared," I said. He gave a small, humorless breath. "I wasn't very good at saying things like that." "No, you weren't." Normally, that might have provoked him. This time it didn't. He looked at the letter one last time before meeting my eyes. There was a long silence, and then he said 3 words I had imagined, hearing so many times that I had eventually stopped believing they would ever come. "I was wrong." Nothing followed. No but. No explanation about the sacrifices he had made or the way he had been raised. No attempt to divide the responsibility evenly between us so the apology would cost him less. He didn't tell me that I had also been stubborn, that I could have called more often, or that I should try to understand his perspective. He simply stood there holding evidence of what he had done and said, "I was wrong." I had spent enough years wanting those words that I thought hearing them would produce something enormous. Instead, what I felt was quiet. It was almost like hearing a lock turn on a door I had already learned to live without opening. "I accept that," I said. Relief appeared on his face immediately. It was quick and almost painfully hopeful, and I knew I had to be careful with what came next, because forgiveness can be misunderstood when people are desperate for absolution. "But accepting that you were wrong doesn't mean the last 10 years disappear." His expression settled. "I know. I'm not interested in pretending none of it happened just because tonight went differently. I understand. And I can forgive something without going back to the way things were before it." He nodded slowly, and for once I believed he was actually listening rather than waiting for his chance to speak. That was the only version of reconciliation I could accept. I had never believed in the kind where one emotional conversation magically erases years of damage, and everyone walks away restored to some imagined version of what they used to be. Some things cannot be restored because the original structure is gone. The only honest choice is deciding whether there is enough left to build something new. My father handed the letter back to me, but I didn't immediately put it away. I looked down at his handwriting and realized the paper felt different in my hands. Now, for years, it had carried the force of a verdict. That night, it was simply an old letter written by a man who had been wrong about his daughter. "So," he said after a moment, "is there still a chance for me?" I looked at him, and there was something almost unfamiliar in his expression. Vulnerability had never sat naturally on Charles Whitaker. He looked more comfortable negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts than asking his own daughter whether she might allow him back into some part of her life. Yet standing there, he looked almost like a younger man, someone who had finally reached a situation where confidence could not protect him from the answer. I didn't respond immediately. Through the open end of the hallway, I could see part of the reception continuing beyond us. People were still talking beneath the chandeliers, staff were moving quietly between groups, and somewhere in that room were officers who knew an entire version of me that my father was meeting for the first time. 10 years earlier, I would have answered his question based on how badly I wanted him back. That night, I finally understood that wanting a relationship did not mean surrendering the boundaries that had allowed me to survive without one. "That depends," I said. "On what?" "On what you do after tonight." He studied me for a second, then nodded. "Fair enough." The words were simple, but coming from him they mattered. He didn't bargain for better terms or ask me to promise anything in return. He accepted that repairing the relationship would require more than a dramatic evening, and that I was not obligated to trust a change he had only just begun. We walked back toward the main reception together. But something about the distance between us had changed. My father stayed a few steps behind, instead of automatically moving beside me. He didn't try to guide me through the crowd or steer me toward someone he believed I should meet. When the two-star general spotted me returning, he smiled and called across the room, "There you are, Major." I went toward him, and my father followed without trying to turn the moment into his own introduction. The general spoke with me briefly, then noticed Charles nearby and addressed him directly. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "your daughter has earned every bit of respect she receives in this room." I glanced at my father almost instinctively. Earlier in the evening, I would have expected him to respond by mentioning his company or identifying some shared connection, anything that allowed him to position himself within the statement. Instead, he looked at the general, then at me. "I know," he said. That was all. 2 words delivered without performance. They meant more to me than I wanted them to. For the rest of the reception, my father behaved differently. The change wasn't dramatic enough that anyone else would necessarily have noticed. He still shook hands when people approached him and responded when old contacts started conversations. But the hunger to control the room seemed to have faded. When people came to speak with me, he didn't insert himself. When another officer mentioned an assignment we had shared, my father listened, instead of trying to redirect the conversation towards something familiar. More than once, I caught him watching me, but for the first time it didn't feel like evaluation. He wasn't checking my posture or measuring whether I was representing the family correctly. He was observing a person he had failed to know. Near the end of the night, the crowd began thinning. The formal program had ended, and the energy of the room softened as people collected coats, exchanged final handshakes, and made promises to follow up the next week. I had just finished a conversation when I noticed my father approaching again. Part of me braced automatically because old habits survive longer than we like to admit. I expected another offer, perhaps a softer version of the job at Whitaker Defense Logistics, or maybe a suggestion that we meet with his attorney and repair whatever financial arrangements had been changed during our estrangement. He stopped in front of me and surprised me again. "I'd like to get to know you," he said. For a few seconds, I didn't know what to say. He didn't say he wanted me back. He didn't ask when I would come home, as though the house in Northern Virginia were still the center of my life. He didn't offer me money or a title. He didn't even ask me to forgive him again. He simply wanted to know me. 4 words. They were smaller than almost anything he had said all night, and somehow they carried more weight. I looked at the man standing in front of me and thought about the last decade all at once. I remembered walking out of his house with one duffel bag over my shoulder. I remembered the first morning of training when my body hurt and my pride hurt worse. I remembered phone calls after promotions and the empty feeling that followed them. I remembered learning not to call at all. I remembered standing alone inside the first house I had ever bought and realizing that every imperfect inch of it belonged to a life I had built myself. I remembered the letter in my bag and the sentence that had once made me believe I no longer had a family. Then I thought about the man who had just said, without excuse, that he had been wrong. I extended my hand. He looked at it for a moment, then took it. It wasn't the polished handshake I had watched him give business contacts all evening. There was no firmness designed to communicate authority, no practiced smile, and no sense that either of us was closing a deal. He held my hand a little longer than a normal handshake required, and I understood that neither of us knew exactly what came next. For once, that uncertainty didn't frighten me. We didn't leave the White House magically repaired. 10 years of distance did not vanish between one handshake and the next morning. There were still conversations ahead of us, and I knew some of them would be uncomfortable. Trust would have to be rebuilt in ordinary ways, through phone calls answered, promises kept, boundaries respected, and the slow accumulation of evidence that tonight had meant something beyond the emotion of the moment. But we were finally standing on level ground. No money between us. No job offer. No threat. No need for me to prove anything. No need for him to pretend he had always understood. When I turned and headed back toward the main hall one final time, I heard my father behind me speaking quietly. I'm not even sure he realized I could hear him. Someone near him must have asked about me. Or perhaps he was simply saying the words to himself, because he was trying them differently for the first time. That's my daughter. I kept walking. There had been a time when hearing him say those words with pride would have meant everything to me. I had once believed that if I worked hard enough, achieved enough, endured enough, and became impressive enough, I could eventually force my father to see me differently. For years, I imagined his approval as the finish line waiting at the end of every difficult road. I was wrong about that. His approval was never the finish line. The victory had already happened long before he understood it. It happened every time I continued after being told I would fail. It happened when I earned my commission, when I accepted responsibilities that frightened me, when I stood beside people who trusted me with their lives, and when I bought a small house with a bad gutter and a kitchen I had to rebuild with money I had earned myself. It happened quietly over 10 years while my father was waiting for me to come home defeated. Charles Whitaker had spent most of his life believing money could buy almost anything worth having. It could buy a larger house, a better car, a place at exclusive tables, professional loyalty, political access, and relationships with people powerful enough to answer his calls. It could make life easier, safer, and more comfortable in ways I would never pretend were meaningless. But there was one thing his $35 million had never been able to purchase: the respect I had earned for myself. And there was something else it could never buy either: the right to define who I was. That night, I finally understood that my father becoming proud of me was not the greatest victory of my life. The greatest victory was realizing that whether he was proud or not, I already knew exactly who I had become. Maybe that was why I could finally offer him another chance. I no longer needed our relationship to repair something missing inside me. I wasn't inviting him back because I needed his money, his approval, his protection, or his permission. I could meet him as the woman I had become and decide, slowly and carefully, whether there was room for him in the life I had built. For the first time, we had a chance to know each other without a debt attached to it. I don't know whether every broken relationship deserves reconciliation. Some don't. Sometimes walking away permanently is the healthiest choice a person can make, and forgiveness does not automatically require another chance. What I learned from my father was something more personal. There is a difference between forgiveness and surrender, between accepting an apology and pretending the injury never happened, and between loving someone and allowing that person to define your worth. For 10 years, I thought I was walking away from my father. What I was actually walking toward was myself. And by the time he finally turned around enough to see me, I no longer needed him to tell me I had chosen the right road. I already knew. If you've ever had to walk away from someone you loved just to discover who you were without their expectations, then you probably understand why that night stayed with me. Maybe you've had a parent who could only love the version of you they imagined. Maybe you spent years chasing approval that always seemed one achievement farther away. Or maybe you reached the same point I did and realized that becoming yourself sometimes requires disappointing someone who thought your life belonged to them. If any part of this story felt familiar, tell me about it in the comments. I read those stories because sometimes the most powerful reminder we can give each other is that choosing your own life does not mean you stop loving the people who wanted something different for you. And if you want more stories about family, pride, sacrifice, and the long, complicated road people sometimes take back toward one another, stay with us and subscribe. There are more stories waiting, and I'll see you in the next one.